April 19, 1775. A gunshot shatters the early morning silence in Lexington, Massachusetts. No one knows who fired it. British redcoats and colonist militiamen stare at each other through the spring mist, frozen for a second that seems to last forever. Then all hell breaks loose. Musket volleys illuminate the gloom. Men fall. Blood stains the damp grass of the town square. In less than 15 minutes, 8 colonists lie dead. The British Empire has just fired on its own subjects. There is no turning back. The war has begun. But this war didn't really begin that morning. To understand that shot, we must go back 13 years, to the exact moment when Great Britain won a war and, unwittingly, began to lose a continent. It is 1763. The 7 Years' War has just ended. France has been driven out of North America. The British Empire stretches from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It is the undisputed global power, controlling a quarter of world trade. Its 13 American colonies are thriving: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. More than 2 million colonists live there, proud to be British. But London has a problem. The war has emptied the royal coffers. The national debt has doubled. And King George III has a simple solution: let the colonies pay for their own defense. March 1765. The British Parliament passes the Stamp Act. It seems harmless: a small tax on legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. Each piece of paper must bear an official stamp proving that the tax was paid. But the colonists see something more sinister: a direct tax imposed without their consent. They have no representatives in the Parliament in London. No taxation without representation becomes the rallying cry that sweeps through the colonies like wildfire. In Boston, a mob attacks the tax collector's house. In the streets of colonial cities, secret groups called the Sons of Liberty stage violent protests. They hang effigies of British officials. They burn shipments of stamped paper. The terror works. Most of the tax collectors resign out of fear. London backs down and repeals the law in 1766. The colonists celebrate. But Parliament simultaneously passes the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute right to legislate over the colonies in all cases. It is a poisoned victory. Tensions simmered for the next few years. London imposed new taxes on glass, paper, paint, and tea. The colonists responded with boycotts. British merchants lost fortunes. In 1770, London repealed almost all the taxes. Almost all. They kept the tea tax, small and symbolic. Prime Minister Lord North explained it simply: there must be a tax to maintain the law. That right will cost an empire. December 1773. 3 ships laden with tea from the East India Company are afloat in Boston Harbor. The governor refuses to return them to England unloaded. The Patriots refuse to allow the taxed tea to be unloaded. On the night of December 16th, as the moon sets behind the clouds, dozens of men disguised as Mohawk Indians board the ships. For 3 hours, they open 342 chests of tea and dump their contents into the salty water. 45 tons of tea dissolve into the Atlantic. London responds with fury. The spring of 1774 brings the intolerable acts. The port of Boston is closed until payment is made for the destroyed tea. The government of Massachusetts is placed under direct military control. British officials accused of crimes will be tried in England, not in the colonies. British soldiers may be forcibly quartered in private homes. The colonies saw these laws not as a punishment for Boston, but as a warning to all. If they could destroy Massachusetts' self-government, they could do so anywhere. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress was a revolutionary act, the colonies acting together, without London's permission. They drafted petitions. They organized boycotts. But some were preparing something more. They began stockpiling weapons and gunpowder. General Thomas Gage, the British military commander in Boston, received alarming intelligence in April 1775. Rebels were stockpiling weapons in Concord, a town 30 kilometers from Boston. Gage decided to act. On the night of April 18th, 700 British soldiers secretly marched to Concord with orders to destroy the weapons cache and arrest rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But there are no secrets in Boston. An intricate system of patriotic surveillance detects movement. Paul Revere and William Dawes ride furiously through the night, shouting warnings. When the British arrive in Lexington at dawn, 77 militiamen await them in the town square, more of a symbolic challenge than an actual military force. Captain John Parker, the militia leader, reportedly orders, "Don't fire unless you're fired upon. But if you want a war, let it begin here." After the shooting at Lexington, the British advanced on Concord. They found and destroyed some supplies, but the colonists had hidden most of them. At the North Bridge in Concord, another skirmish broke out. More gunfire. More dead. The British began their retreat to Boston around noon. What followed was a nightmare. Thousands of colonist militiamen have arrived from surrounding villages. They don't fight like Europeans in orderly formations. They hide behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. They fire and disappear. The redcoats march in columns, perfect targets. The 30-kilometer road to Boston becomes a death corridor. The British lose discipline, running in panic. Only the arrival of reinforcements prevents total annihilation. At the end of the day, the British counted 273 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The colonists lost 95 men. But they had achieved something psychologically devastating. They had bled the most feared professional army in the world. The news spread through the colonies in days. The militia grew exponentially. Boston was besieged by an improvised army of colonists. War was now inevitable. May 1775. The Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia. Technically, the colonies are still part of Great Britain. Technically, this is a protest, not a rebellion. But the decisions they make cross invisible lines. They authorize the creation of the Continental Army. They appoint a commander, George Washington, a 43-year-old Virginia planter with limited military experience but an impeccable reputation. Washington accepts without pay, only expenses. It is June 15, 1775. He doesn't know that he has just committed himself to 8 years of war, crushing defeats, betrayals, hunger, and despair. He doesn't know that he will face the most powerful army on earth with poorly equipped peasants who can hardly be considered soldiers. But something within him understands the magnitude of the moment. Before leaving for Boston to assume command, he writes to his wife Martha, "Far from seeking this appointment, I have avoided it as much as I could. But as it has been destiny that compels me, I will answer the call." Destiny. That word will echo through the years to come as an unlikely band of rebels defies logic, the odds, and the greatest imperial power the world has ever known. But can they truly win? Or will this experiment end in gallows for their leaders and renewed enslavement for their colonies? What happens in the next 8 years will change not only America, but the entire world. June 1775. Boston is an island of redcoats in a sea of rebellion. Inside the city, 9,000 British soldiers are crammed together with civilians loyal to the king. Outside, 16,000 colonial militiamen surround the city in barely organized chaos. They have no standard uniforms, no formal military training, and no clear chain of command. They are farmers with muskets, craftsmen with hunting rifles, students with hand-me-down pistols. George Washington is still riding from Virginia toward this army he is supposed to command. Meanwhile, the colonial military leaders are studying the terrain. Boston is connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. To the north and south, 2 peninsulas overlook the city, Charlestown to the north and Dorchester to the south. Whoever controls those heights controls Boston. The British know this. The colonists know this. It's just a matter of who acts first. On the night of June 16th, 1,200 colonists marched silently toward the Charlestown Peninsula. Their orders: fortify Bunker Hill, the highest hill. But in the darkness, someone made a crucial mistake. They headed for Breed's Hill, closer to Boston and more exposed. Some historians say it was confusion. Others suggest strategy. Breed's Hill more directly threatened the British, forcing them to attack. They work frantically all night. Picks and shovels pound the rocky ground. They build a makeshift fort, 2-meter-high earthen walls in the shape of a square. When the sun rises on June 17th, the British awaken to an enemy fortification that didn't exist yesterday. On the British warships in the harbor, the cannons roar. Cannonballs tear through the air. But the earthen fortifications absorb the impacts. The settlers, terrified but disciplined, keep digging. General William Howe, the British tactical commander, assesses the situation from Boston. He could lay siege to the position, cutting off supplies until the colonists surrender. He could attack their rear, trapping them. But he chooses a show of force, a massive frontal assault. He will send his professional troops uphill in perfect formation. The rebels will see imperial power marching toward them and will flee. It will be swift, psychological, and decisive. It is midday when 2,200 redcoats begin disembarking on the peninsula. They march in immaculate formations, their red uniforms gleaming in the June sun, bayonets flashing. Drums beat the rhythm. It is a calculated display of power meant to intimidate. Inside the fort, the colonists watch silently. Many have never seen combat. Their hands tremble. Colonel William Prescott, the colonial commander, walks among them with studied calm. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The British advance uphill, perfect lines, steady pace. 90 meters. 60. 45. The silence from the colonist fortifications is unnatural, terrifying. 30 meters. The British officers ahead can see the faces of the rebels. Then the world explodes. The volley is devastating. Hundreds of muskets fire simultaneously. The British front line disintegrates. Men fall like cut wheat. Those who follow stumble over bodies. Another volley. More fall. British training breaks down. Soldiers turn and run downhill in panic. Officers shout orders that no one hears. Howe reforms the lines. He attacks again. The result is identical. Carnage, panic, retreat. British dead and wounded litter the hillside. The grass is red. Charlestown, the village at the foot of the hill, burns after British incendiary shells attempt to dislodge settler snipers. Black smoke mingles with gunpowder fumes. The third British assault is different. Howe, desperate, changes tactics. He concentrates his forces. He attacks the weakest point in the defenses. And the colonists face a deadly problem. They are running out of ammunition. The volleys become irregular, sporadic. The British, finally, reach the walls. Bayonets against rifle butts. Brutal hand-to-hand combat. The colonists, without bayonets and ammunition, could not hold their position. They retreated, fighting with their backs to the enemy. The retreat was chaotic, but not a complete collapse. Dr. Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and one of the most prominent Patriot leaders, was killed covering the retreat. His loss devastated the movement. The British captured the hill. Technically, it is a British victory, but at a dreadful cost. Over 1,000 British casualties out of 2,200 men engaged. The colonists lose about 450. General Henry Clinton, another British commander, sums up the bitter irony. A few more victories like this, and we won't have any soldiers left in Britain to bring news of them. George Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 2 weeks after Bunker Hill. He assumed command of the Continental Army on July 3, 1775. What he found horrified him. It wasn't an army. It was a convention of local militia clubs. There was no uniform discipline. There was no clear command structure. Soldiers elected their own officers. Regiments refused to obey orders from officers in other colonies. Medical care was primitive. Supplies were chaotic. Washington imposes order with an iron fist. He establishes hierarchies. He demands military salutes. He punishes desertion severely. Some resent him, this Virginian aristocrat treating free farmers like regular soldiers. But others recognize the necessity. If they are going to fight the British Army, they need to resemble an army more than a mob. Meanwhile, the siege of Boston continues, a tense stalemate. The British cannot break it. The colonists cannot storm the city. Both sides wait. But wait for what? In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was caught in a schizophrenic contradiction. In July of 1775, they drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a direct appeal to King George III expressing loyalty and pleading for reconciliation. Simultaneously, they authorized the invasion of Canada. Logic is twisted. We are not at war with the king, only with his corrupt parliament. We are fighting to restore our rights as Britons, not for independence. It's political gymnastics, but it reflects a reality. Many settlers still hope for reconciliation. Independence remains a radical idea, unthinkable for most. King George III never reads the petition. By the time he arrives in London in August, he has already declared the colonies to be in open and declared rebellion. There is no negotiation with rebels. only submission or destruction. The winter of 1775 to 1776 was miserable for both armies. In Boston, the British suffered from shortages of supplies. Firewood was scarce. They burned abandoned buildings for warmth. Food was rationed. Morale was rotting. Outside of Boston, the colonists suffered just as much. Enlistment terms expire. The men want to go home for the harvest, to their families. Washington struggles to maintain a functioning army as his forces dwindle and are constantly replaced with untrained recruits. But Washington has a plan that will change everything. Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller turned artillery officer, proposes something audacious to the point of madness: to bring cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, captured by the colonists in May, across hundreds of miles of winter territory to bombard Boston. Knox sets off in December with an expedition. He risks everything on a seemingly impossible logistical gamble. If he fails, nothing changes. If he succeeds, meanwhile, something else is changing in colonial minds. A pamphlet published in January 1776 begins to circulate explosively. It is called Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, argues the unthinkable. Independence is not treason, it is necessity. Monarchy is not natural, it is absurd. America does not need Great Britain. Great Britain needs America. 150,000 copies are sold in a matter of months in colonies with 2 million inhabitants. Independence, once radical, is beginning to sound like common sense. March 1776. Henry Knox accomplishes the impossible. For 2 months, his expedition hauls 59 cannons across 300 kilometers of snow, ice, and mountains. They use oxen, horses, and sleds. They cross frozen rivers, praying that the ice will hold. It is a logistical feat that defies belief. When the cannons reach Cambridge, Washington executes his plan. On the night of March 4th, under cover of darkness, colonial troops fortify the Dorchester Heights, south of Boston. When dawn breaks on March 5th, the British awaken to another impossible fortification, this time armed with heavy artillery pointed directly at the city and the ships in the harbor. General William Howe considered attacking another Bunker Hill, but the lessons of that carnage weighed too heavily. The wind prevented the planned assault. Finally, Howe decided the unthinkable: to evacuate Boston. On March 17th, 125 British ships set sail with 9,000 soldiers and 1,000 loyal colonists who feared rebel retaliation. After an 11-month siege, the British left Boston without firing a shot. While Boston celebrates liberation, the North brings disastrous news. The American invasion of Canada, launched in the fall of 1775, collapses into disaster. 2 colonial columns converged on Quebec. One under Richard Montgomery captured Montreal, the other under Benedict Arnold survived a hellish march across the Maine wilderness. They attacked Quebec in a New Year's Eve blizzard. Montgomery was killed. Arnold was wounded. The assault failed. For months, they besieged the city in the Canadian cold, decimated by smallpox, desertion, and starvation. When British reinforcements arrived in the spring, the colonists fled in disarray. The Canadian campaign, intended to create a 14th rebel colony, ended in catastrophe. But it revealed something critical. This was no longer a regional conflict. It was a continental war. June 1776. Philadelphia seethes under the summer heat and the political heat. For over a year, the Continental Congress has managed a war while professing loyalty to a king who calls them traitors. The contradiction is no longer tenable. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposes a resolution. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debate is explosive. Delegates from Pennsylvania, New York, and the Middle Colonies are terrified. Independence is capital treason. If they lose, they're all hanged. Radicals from New England and Virginia counter. They're already treasonous. Retreating now guarantees defeat. Advancing offers at least a chance of victory. Congress postponed the vote until July to allow the colonies time to instruct their delegates. In the meantime, they appointed a committee to draft a declaration justifying independence. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson secluded himself in his Philadelphia lodgings. For 17 days, he wrote and rewrote. He didn't invent new ideas. He synthesized Enlightenment philosophy, John Locke, Rousseau, British Whig thought. But his genius lay in language, transforming political theory into prose that burned with moral authority. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It is revolutionary. Government does not come from God through kings. It comes from the people. If a government violates natural rights, the people can abolish it. The Declaration then lists 27 grievances against King George, building the legal and moral case for separation. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted on independence. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained, awaiting instructions. Technically, America became independent on July 2nd. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail predicting that this day shall be celebrated by generations to come as the great anniversary festival, with pomp and parades, shows, games, sports, cannons, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. But Adams is wrong by 2 days. Congress spends July 3rd and 4th debating Jefferson's text. They cut about a quarter of the draft, including a passage attacking slavery that offends the Southern delegates. On July 4th, they approve the final text. It is the declaration, not the vote, that history remembers. When the news spreads, the colonies erupt in celebration and anxiety. In New York, where Washington's army awaits the British invasion, a mob tears down a statue of King George III. The lead will be melted down into bullets. In London, when the news arrives in August, the King and Parliament respond with fury. The rebels will be crushed. The summer of 1776 brought a terrifying spectacle to New York. From the end of June, British ships began to arrive, and they kept coming. During July and August, the fleet grew to proportions never before seen in American waters, 400 ships carrying 32,000 soldiers. It was the largest military expedition Great Britain had ever mounted. The British also sent 8,000 German mercenaries, mainly from Hesse Castle, paid by George III to suppress the rebellion. The colonists simply called them Hessians, although they came from various German states. Their reputation for brutal discipline preceded them. Washington has fewer than 20,000 men, many of them short-staffed, untrained militiamen. He is trying to defend Brooklyn Heights, the key to Manhattan. If the British take those heights, their artillery will overwhelm the entire city. Washington divides his forces between Manhattan and Long Island. It is a mistake that nearly ends the war before it even begins. August 27, 1776. The British attack. General Howe executes a masterful flanking maneuver. While feigning frontal attacks, he marches the main force around the colonial left flank during the night. At dawn, the Americans discover the enemy in their rear. The trap is sprung. What follows is a disaster. The Americans fight bravely but are outmatched in maneuverability, numbers, and training. Entire units are surrounded and captured. Retreat turns into defeat. Only the strong defenses around Brooklyn prevent total annihilation. Washington watches helplessly from Manhattan as his First Army is crushed. By nightfall, 9,000 Americans are trapped in Brooklyn with their backs to the East River. The British outnumber them 2-1 and are able to completely encircle them by dawn. The war could end here. A British assault captures Washington and the Continental leadership. The rebellion collapses. But Howe hesitates. Instead of assaulting, he decides to lay siege. It is the decision that saves the revolution. On the night of August 29th, Washington orders an emergency evacuation. It is ridiculously risky, moving 9,000 men across a river right under the enemy's nose. The Marblehead, Massachusetts, Marine Regiment, skilled fishermen and sailors, rowed tirelessly throughout the night. Barges, rowboats, anything that would float. The troops marched silently, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. A miraculous shift in the wind and a thick fog at dawn concealed the last boats. By the time the British discovered the abandoned defenses, the Americans had vanished. It is a defeat turned into a heroic escape. But only an escape. New York falls. In September, the British occupy the city, which they will hold until the end of the war. Washington retreats through Manhattan, then through New Jersey. His army disintegrates. Enlistment terms expire. Men desert. Winter is coming. In December, the army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Washington had fewer than 3,000 men. The Continental Congress fled from Philadelphia to Baltimore. Patriots everywhere were in despair. The cause seemed lost. Thomas Paine, now serving with the army, writes by a campfire. These are the times that test the souls of men. His pamphlet, The American Crisis, is published on December 19th. Washington has it read to the troops. But inspirational words won't win the war. Washington needs a victory, a real one, or the revolution will die with the old year. December 23, 1776. The night is dark and bitter at the American camp in Pennsylvania. George Washington meets with his officers. The news is all bad. His army is dwindling daily. On December 31st, most enlistments expire. Without victory, without hope, no one will enlist again. The revolution will end not with a battle, but with a sigh of resignation. Washington proposes a daring move. Attack Trenton, New Jersey, where 1,400 Hessians are quartered for the winter. Cross the Delaware River in the dead of night. March 15 kilometers in the dark, attack at dawn. If it fails, they lose their army. If it succeeds, they gain something worth more than territory, hope. His generals are divided. Some consider it madness. Others see madness as their only option. Washington is adamant. The attack will be on Christmas night, when the enemy is least alert. Victory or death, he writes as the code word for the operation. There is no exaggeration in those words. On the afternoon of December 25th, 2,400 men began moving toward the Delaware River. The weather was brutal, freezing rain mixed with snow, sub-zero temperatures, and winds that cut like knives. The river was full of floating ice floes. The conditions were so terrible that two separate attack columns, which were supposed to cross at other points, never made it across. But Washington's main column, again using Marblehead's regiment for rowing, persists. For 9 hours in the dark, they move troops, cannons, horses, and supplies. Ice floes pound the boats. The men use poles to push the blocks. Some fall into the icy water. Soldiers shiver uncontrollably. The crossing was to be completed by midnight, so they could attack before dawn. It is completed at 3 in the morning. Washington alters the plan. They march faster, divided into two columns that will converge on Trenton from different directions. Many men lack proper boots. They leave trails of blood in the snow. Some collapse from hypothermia. The officers lift them up, push them forward. To stop is to die. To keep going could save America. 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26th. Trenton awakens to shouts and gunfire. The Americans are attacking from two directions simultaneously. The Hessians, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, are completely taken by surprise. Contrary to popular myth, they are not drunk from Christmas celebrations. But they are relaxed, overconfident, not expecting attacks in winter. It is a fatal mistake. American artillery dominates the streets. The Hessians attempt to form lines, but musket and cannon fire decimates them. Rall, on horseback, tries to organize a counteroffensive. A bullet brings him down. Mortally wounded, he orders the surrender. In less than an hour, the battle is over. 900 Hessians captured, more than 100 enemy casualties. American losses, 2 soldiers killed by exposure during the march, 4 wounded in combat. It's a tactically small victory. 1 town, 1,000 prisoners. But psychologically, it's everything. British invincibility is shattered. The Americans can win. Patriots everywhere receive the news like oxygen to a drowning man. Washington could withdraw, declare victory, and spend the winter in safety. But he understands psychology. A victory is not enough to change the course of the war. He needs to consolidate, to expand. He recrosses the Delaware with his prisoners on the 27th, then crosses back into New Jersey on the 30th with troops reinforced by militias inspired by Trenton. Trenton is occupied again, but this time the British respond. General Cornwallis marches from New York with 8,000 men. On January 2, 1777, the British army reaches Trenton. Skirmishes continue until nightfall. The Americans are trapped, their backs against the Delaware River. Cornwallis, confident, decides to wait until morning for the final assault. "We've finally got the old fox," he says. "We'll get him in the morning." That night, Washington executed another bold move. He left campfires burning, some men making camp noise. The rest of the army marched silently around the British flank using a little-known road. By dawn, they had vanished. January 3, 1777. Washington's army, exhausted after marching all night, encounters two British regiments marching towards Trenton. Neither side waits for the other. The Battle of Princeton erupts spontaneously. The Americans initially fall back. The militia breaks under the British attack. Defeat seems imminent. Then Washington rides straight to the front, between his retreating troops and the advancing British. He stops just 50 yards from the enemy lines, an impossible-to-miss figure on his big gray horse. The officers expect to see him fall, but their courage galvanizes the troops. They regroup. The British, now surprised by the ferocity of the counterattack, retreat. Washington gives chase, his men shouting. The British flee toward New Brunswick. It is another American victory, this time against British regular troops, not German mercenaries. Washington wants to pursue and attack the British supply depots in New Brunswick. But his men are beyond human endurance. Some are literally sleeping on the march. He withdraws the army to Morristown, New Jersey, to defensive positions on hills from where he can threaten the British supply lines. The victories at Trenton and Princeton transform the war. The British evacuate most of New Jersey, consolidating their power in New York. American recruitment surges. Soldiers whose enlistments have expired are re-enlisted. New volunteers arrive. The Continental Congress is able to return to Philadelphia. Internationally, the victories resonate. Europe watches with renewed interest. Could these rebels truly stand a chance? France, Britain's traditional enemy, begins to consider secret support. Spain observes cautiously. The revolution, which seemed to be dying in December, now has a pulse. But the war is far from over. Great Britain sends more troops. It plans campaigns for 1777 that will divide the colonies and crush the rebellion. The British strategy is elegant. Cut New England off from the rest of the colonies by controlling the Hudson River corridor. The British plan for 1777 involved three armies converging on Albany, New York. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada with 8,000 men. A smaller force under Colonel Barry Street Ledger would advance east from Lake Ontario. General Howe would march north from New York to join them. Control of Hudson would divide the rebel colonies. New England, the radical heart of the revolution, would be cut off. But the plan requires precise coordination among three commanders separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. And Howe has his own ideas. Instead of marching north, Howe decides to attack Philadelphia, the rebel capital. His logic, capturing the capital will break the rebel will. But it means that Burgoyne, marching south from Canada, will be alone. The British High Command fails to coordinate its generals. It is a strategic error that will prove costly. The summer of 1777 was a military chess game. In June, Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga almost without resistance, sending panic through the American lines. But then his advance stalled. The wild terrain between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River was a logistical nightmare. The Americans cut down massive trees across roads, diverted streams to create swamps, and destroyed bridges. Burgoyne is advancing only a few miles a day. His supply lines are stretched dangerously. He needs fodder, food, horses. He sends a scouting force to Bennington, Vermont. It is ambushed by local militia on August 16th. Nearly 1,000 British and Germans are killed or captured. Burgoyne's first major setback. Meanwhile, Howe loads his army onto ships in New York and sails to the Chesapeake Bay, a long and perplexing journey. He lands south of Philadelphia in August. Washington attempts to blockade him at Brandywine Creek on September 11th. It is another American defeat. Howe outflanks Washington, inflicting heavy casualties. The road to Philadelphia is open. The Continental Congress evacuates again, this time to York, Pennsylvania. The British enter Philadelphia on September 26th. It is a symbolic victory, but Washington and his army remain intact. And to the north, Burgoyne faces mounting problems. The U.S. Northern Army, now commanded by General Horatio Gates, grows larger every day. Militia from New England and New York stream into the camp. By early September, Gates has more men than Burgoyne. The tables have turned. The hunter is becoming the hunted. The battle that will decide the fate of Burgoyne's campaign Perhaps the fate of the entire war is approaching, and it will take place in a location no one remembers now, but which the world will soon not forget. Saratoga, September 1777. General John Burgoyne looks south from his position near Saratoga, New York, and sees his dream of military glory turn into a nightmare. His army, once 8,000 strong, now numbers fewer than 6,000 after casualties, disease, and detachments. Ahead, Horatio Gates's U.S. Army, more than 12,000 men, blocks the road to Albany. Burgoyne awaits reinforcements that never arrive. Howe is in Philadelphia, ignoring implicit orders to support him. St. Ledger, attacked by militia at Fort Stanwix, has withdrawn to Canada. Burgoyne stands alone, his supply lines stretched to the breaking point, surrounded by hostile militia. To retreat to Canada would be to admit defeat. To advance is to risk everything. British pride demands to advance. On September 19th, Burgoyne attacked American positions at Bemis Heights, near Freeman's Farm. What followed was one of the fiercest battles of the war. The British advance in 3 columns through dense forests and farmland. The Americans, well positioned on defensive terrain, wait. The American rifle units, particularly Daniel Morgan's marksmen, are devastatingly effective. They target British officers, breaking the chain of command. The battle becomes a hellish, hours-long assault. The British repeatedly attack the American position. The Americans counterattack. The men fight in open spaces with no cover. The gunpowder smoke is so thick that visibility drops to meters. The noise is deafening. General Benedict Arnold, without official command after a falling out with Gates, gallops to the front, ignoring orders. His aggressive leadership inspires the troops. But Gates calls him back, furious at the insubordination. The battle ends inconclusively at nightfall. The British hold the field, but have suffered twice as many casualties as the Americans. And they are no closer to Albany. For the next 3 weeks, Burgoyne waited. He waited for impossible reinforcements. He waited for Washington to allow British troops in New York to march north. He waited for miracles. Meanwhile, the American encirclement tightened. Every day, more militiamen arrived. Gates' army grew to more than 15,000. On October 7th, Burgoyne could wait no longer. His supplies would last only days. He launched a reconnaissance force, 15,000 men testing the American lines for a weakness. It was a desperate gamble disguised as a prudent tactic. The Americans detect the movement. Morgan attacks the British flank. The Battle of Bemis Heights erupts with renewed fury. Benedict Arnold, confined to the camp by Gates after Freeman's Farm, hears the sounds of battle and cannot contain himself. He mounts his horse and gallops into the fray without orders, technically in outright disobedience. But the soldiers adore him. When he appears, shouting orders and leading charges, his presence electrifies the American line. Arnold leads an assault against the British fortifications. His horse is struck and falls, trapping Arnold's leg beneath it. A bullet pierces the same leg that was wounded at Quebec. He is seriously injured, but his attack has broken the British line. The Americans capture key fortifications. The British retreat in disarray. Burgoyne's losses are catastrophic, 600 men lost. Worse still, General Simon Fraser, his most capable commander, is mortally wounded by an American sniper. Fraser dies that night, pleading with Burgoyne to withdraw while he still can. Burgoyne retreats north toward Saratoga, closely pursued by the Americans. His army is demoralized, hungry, and exhausted. They reach Saratoga on October 9th and dig in, waiting for what? There is no rescue possible. The Americans completely surround them. American artillery bombards them constantly. Supplies dwindle. On October 12th, Burgoyne convened a council of war. Some officers suggested breaking the encirclement, abandoning the wounded and supplies in a desperate dash to Canada. Others argued it was too late. The Americans surrounded them, outnumbered them 2-1, and knew the terrain. An escape would only result in a massacre. On October 13th, Burgoyne opened negotiations with Gates. The proud British general sought to safeguard his honor even in defeat. He would not surrender unconditionally. He proposed a convention. His army would surrender its weapons, but would be repatriated to Great Britain on his word that he would not serve again in America. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne's army marched in formation for the last time. 5,700 British and German soldiers, The survivors of the Great Expedition laid down their arms before the Americans. Burgoyne ceremonially presented his sword to Gates. The American soldiers watch in silence. Many are farmers who left their fields to fight. Now they have defeated a professional British army, forcing it to surrender completely. It is the first major American victory of the war, the first time an entire British army has surrendered. The implications are seismic. In the colonies, patriotic fervor soars. The narrative of British invincibility is shattered. The Continental Congress celebrates. Washington, still facing how near Philadelphia, receives a massive morale boost. But the true impact of Saratoga will be felt on the other side of the Atlantic. December 1777. Benjamin Franklin, now the American ambassador to France, receives news from Saratoga in Paris. For more than a year, he has courted the French court, seeking an alliance. The French have provided covert aid, weapons, ammunition, money funneled through shell companies. But an open alliance, war against Great Britain, that required proof that the Americans could actually win. Saratoga is that proof. Franklin, 71 years old, a shrewd diplomat behind the image of a provincial sage, exploits the victory masterfully. King Louis XVI and his government see an opportunity to weaken Great Britain, to recover pride lost in the 7 Years' War, and possibly to reclaim lost territories. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed two treaties, a treaty of friendship and commerce, and a treaty of alliance. France recognized American independence. More importantly, it pledged to go to war if Great Britain and France came to conflict over America. This was the strategic shift Washington had desperately needed. But while Paris celebrates, Washington's army suffers its darkest hour. From December 1777 to June 1778, they camp at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 30 kilometers from British-occupied Philadelphia. Valley Forge becomes synonymous with suffering. 12,000 men camp in makeshift huts through a brutal winter. Supplies are chronically inadequate. Food is severely rationed. Many soldiers lack proper shoes, coats, or blankets. Disease, typhus, pneumonia, dysentery, kills more effectively than the enemy. More than 2,000 men died during the winter. Washington is constantly at odds with Congress, with individual states, begging for supplies that never arrive in sufficient numbers. Some in Congress murmur about replacing him with Gates, the hero of Saratoga. The Conway Conspiracy, a semi-secret attempt to undermine Washington, nearly succeeds. But Washington persists. And in February, unexpected help arrives. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former Prussian officer, volunteers to train the army. Steuben, with a blend of European military training and American ingenuity, transforms the peasants into soldiers. He teaches formations, fire discipline, and bayonet tactics. By spring, the emerging Continental Army of Valley Forge is fundamentally different, still poorly equipped, but finally professional. On May 6, 1778, Washington announced to the army that France had entered the war. The men who survived Valley Forge celebrated wildly. After 3 years of fighting alone against the most powerful empire in the world, they finally had an ally. Warfare had changed. It was now truly global. The British, facing war with France, had to change their strategy. They could not concentrate all their forces in America. They had to defend the Caribbean, India, and their sea routes. On June 18th, they evacuated Philadelphia, consolidating their forces in New York. Washington pursues them. At Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, on June 28th, the armies clash in the scorching heat. It is a confused battle, nearly lost due to American errors. But Washington, appearing at the critical moment, stabilizes the lines. The battle ends in a tactical draw. But psychologically, it is an American victory. They fought foot to foot with the professional British army without retreating. The war, now in its 4th year, is at a stalemate in the north. But it is about to shift its geographic focus to a region where loyalties are more divided, the fighting more brutal, and the outcomes more uncertain. The South. Late 1778. London rethinks its strategy. The North is at a stalemate. But the South, the British believe, is teeming with hidden loyalists awaiting liberation. The logic: conquer the southern colonies, mobilize the loyalists, restore royal rule colony by colony, then advance north, reclaiming territory. It's a strategy that sounds reasonable on a map in London. In American reality, it will create a brutal civil war within a revolution. On December 29, 1778, British troops captured Savannah, Georgia, in a swift amphibious assault. American resistance collapsed. By January 1779, the British controlled most of Georgia. The first step of the plan worked perfectly. Too perfectly. It gave them a false sense of security. The spring of 1780 brought the most ambitious British objective yet. Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the South. General Henry Clinton sailed from New York with 14,000 men. General Benjamin Lincoln commanded the American defense with 5,000 troops. It's a classic siege. The British surround the city by land and sea. Artillery bombards it constantly. Lincoln, trapped, should evacuate. But Charleston's civilian leaders plead with him to stay. Escape would mean abandoning the city. Staying means risking the army. Lincoln stays. On May 12th, with no hope of relief, he surrenders. 5,000 American soldiers captured, for naval frigates, massive stockpiles of supplies. It is the greatest American defeat of the entire war, more devastating than Long Island or Brandywine. The Confederate Army has been effectively destroyed. With the American army defeated, the British proclaimed victory in the Carolinas. They demanded that the Patriots swear allegiance to the king or face reprisals. It was a fatal overconfidence. Instead of pacifying the region, they ignited a vicious guerrilla war. Bands of partisans, led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens, attack British supplies, ambush detachments, and disappear into forests and swamps. The British are unable to capture them. Each punitive expedition creates more rebels. Worse still, a civil war erupts between patriots and loyalists. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for decades now slaughter each other. Farms are burned. Families are murdered. It is a war without quarter or mercy. British Colonel Banastre Tarleton gains particular notoriety for his brutality, refusing surrenders and massacring prisoners. His name becomes synonymous with British atrocity. Washington sends General Horatio Gates, hero of Saratoga, to rebuild the Southern Army. Gates arrives brimming with confidence. After all, he defeated Burgoyne. How difficult could it be to defeat Cornwallis? On August 16, 1780, Gates faced Cornwallis near Camden, South Carolina. It was a disaster from beginning to end. Gates positioned inexperienced militia on his left flank against British veterans. When the British charged, the militia fled without a fight. The collapse was complete. Gates himself flees on horseback, riding 150 kilometers without stopping, abandoning his army. It is such a cowardly act that it destroys his reputation forever. Baron de Kalb, a brave French volunteer officer, dies heroically trying to save the battle. But the defeat is complete. More than 1,000 Americans killed or captured. The South seems lost. The British control Georgia and the Carolinas. Only Virginia remains in rebel hands. And Cornwallis plans to march there next. But October 1780 brings a small battle with big consequences. At Kings Mountain, on the border between the Carolinas, more than 1,000 loyal militiamen are surrounded by mountain patriots. It is a savage battle with no regular troops on either side. The patriots attack uphill under heavy fire, fall, and attack again. The loyalists surrender. The patriots, enraged by previous atrocities, begin executing prisoners. The officers barely prevent a complete massacre. But the message is clear. The region will not be pacified. Kings Mountain shatters the myth of loyalist superiority. Cornwallis, shaken, postpones his invasion of North Carolina. Meanwhile, Washington makes a crucial decision. Instead of Gates, he sends Nathanael Greene to command the South. Greene, a former Quaker from Rhode Island, is one of Washington's best generals, intelligent, adaptable, and strategically brilliant. Greene arrives in the South in December 1780 and coldly assesses his situation. He has fewer than 2,000 regular troops, vastly outnumbered by Cornwallis. He cannot defeat the British army in open battle, so he will not try. In contrast, Greene employed a strategy of fugitive warfare. He divided his army, forcing Cornwallis to divide his. He constantly harassed the enemy without engaging in decisive battle. He strained British supply lines. He exhausted his troops with endless marches. Working in coordination with local partisans, he turned North and South Carolina into a British logistical nightmare. Greene sends Daniel Morgan with 600 men to threaten the British flank. Cornwallis dispatches Tarleton with 1,000 men to destroy Morgan. The two armies converge at Cowpens, South Carolina. On January 17, 1781, Morgan, cornered against a river, could not retreat. He had to fight. But he turned disadvantage into advantage with an ingenious plan. He positioned the militia in front, ordering them to fire 2 volleys and then withdraw behind the regular troops. It seemed like cowardice. It was genius. Tarleton attacks aggressively. The militia fires and falls back. The British, thinking the Americans are fleeing, break formation and pursue them. When they reach the regular American lines, they find fresh troops in disciplined formation. The American cavalry attacks the British flank. The British forces collapse. Tarleton flees with a few cavalrymen, abandoning his army. The Americans capture 600 men, most of Tarleton's army. It is a tactically perfect American victory, considered one of the best executed battles of the war. Cornwallis receives news from Cowpens with impotent fury. He has lost his best commander and an entire army. Greene is now joining forces with him. Cornwallis decides to risk everything, to hunt down Greene, to destroy him before he escapes. One of the most epic marching campaigns of the war begins, the race to the Dan River. Cornwallis burns his own supply wagons to travel lighter and faster. He pursues Greene across North Carolina in the dead of winter. Both armies march more than 30 kilometers a day through mud, rain, and cold. Greene reaches the Dan River on the Virginia border on February 14th. He has assembled boats on the north side. His army crosses just as Cornwallis arrives. The exhausted, undersupplied British army watches helplessly as the Americans disappear on the other side of the river. Cornwallis retreats to Hillsborough, North Carolina. His army is shattered by the campaign. He proclaims victory and invites loyalists to join him. Few arrive. The population, terrified by years of civil war, does not trust British proclamations. Greene, reinforced in Virginia, recrossed the Dan in March. He accepted battle at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th. It was a British tactical victory. The Americans withdrew. But British casualties were devastating. Cornwallis lost a quarter of his army. Member of Parliament Charles James Fox summed up the paradox in London. Another such victory will destroy the British army. Cornwallis, recognizing that he could not pacify the Carolinas, marched on Virginia. He believed that conquering Virginia, the largest colony, would be the key to victory. And rich, he will end the rebellion. It is a decision that will lead him to an encounter with destiny in a small seaside town called Yorktown. 1781. What began as a colonial revolt has become a world war. France is fighting Great Britain in the Caribbean, capturing valuable sugar islands. Spain, an ally of France but not of the United States, besieges Gibraltar and captures British Florida. The Dutch, after secretly providing support to the rebels, go to war with Great Britain. On the high seas, the British Navy faces combined French and Spanish fleets. In India, French and British forces fight for colonial territories. British military resources are stretched to the breaking point. Prime Minister Lord North, who never wanted this war, is overwhelmed. King George III insists on continuing, but public support is dwindling. For the United States, the French intervention was transformative but complicated. French aid, money, weapons, troops, most importantly the fleet, kept the cause alive. But it also created tensions. French officers sometimes looked down on Americans as amateurs. Americans resented French arrogance. And everyone knew that France wasn't fighting for American freedom, but to weaken Great Britain. The winter of 1780 to 1781 nearly destroyed the Continental Army from within. Encamped in Morristown, New Jersey, the soldiers endured conditions worse than at Valley Forge. Rampant inflation rendered the continental currency worthless. Often unpaid for months, starving and freezing, the soldiers mutinied. In January, 1,500 soldiers from the Pennsylvania line marched toward Philadelphia demanding back pay and proper discharges. They weren't deserting to the enemy, but neither would they continue fighting without recognition. Washington was facing his nightmare, the army disintegrating not from defeat, but from moral collapse. Negotiations finally resolved the Pennsylvania Mutiny. But 2 weeks later, troops in New Jersey mutiny. Washington responds harshly this time. He executes the leaders to prevent total collapse. It is necessary brutality that will haunt him, but it works. The army holds together, barely. September 1780 brings the most painful shock of betrayal of the war. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, Washington's most audacious warrior, has been selling secrets to the British for over a year. Commander of West Point, the crucial fortress controlling the Hudson River, Arnold plans to hand it over to the British for £20,000. The conspiracy is uncovered when the British liaison officer, Major John Andre, is captured with incriminating papers. Arnold barely escapes, fleeing to a British warship. Andre is hanged as a spy, despite his pleas to be shot as an officer. Washington, personally devastated by Arnold's betrayal, writes simply, "Arnold has gone to the British." Arnold's betrayal is complex. He's embittered by missed promotions, accusations of corruption, and disputes with Congress. His wife, Peggy Shippen, from a loyal family, likely influenced his decision. But fundamentally, Arnold believes the cause is lost, that he's switching sides to the inevitable winner. He's wrong. He's about to be spectacularly wrong. Spring of 1781. Cornwallis, leaving the Carolinas after Guilford Courthouse, marches to Virginia with 7,000 men. His logic: Virginia provides men, supplies, and leadership to the rebellion. Conquering Virginia will cripple the entire revolution. He joins British forces already operating in Virginia, including a contingent commanded by Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general. Together, they terrorize the countryside, destroying supply depots and burning plantations. Thomas Jefferson, now governor of Virginia, narrowly escapes capture when the British storm Charlottesville. But Cornwallis faces the problem that has plagued all British operations. They can conquer territory, but they cannot hold it. American guerrillas ambush detachments. The population is hostile. Supplies are scarce. Cornwallis needs a coastal base where the British Navy can resupply him. In August, following orders from General Clinton in New York, Cornwallis established himself in Yorktown, a port town on the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers. He began fortifying the position. It was a good defensive position, provided the British Navy controlled the sea. July 1781. At the American headquarters near New York, Washington receives crucial news. A large French fleet under Admiral de Grasse will sail from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake Bay in August, available for operations until mid-October. Washington seized the opportunity of a lifetime. If de Grasse can temporarily control the sea, if Washington can move his army to Virginia before the British react, if the French General Rochambeau coordinates with him, if the Marquis de Lafayette can hold off Cornwallis until they arrive, there are many ifs. But it's the best opportunity they'll ever have. The plan requires perfect coordination between 3 separate armies and a naval fleet across hundreds of miles. It requires deceiving Clinton in New York into thinking Washington plans to attack there. It requires miraculous speed in moving armies through wild terrain. It requires luck. Washington is trying anyway. August 1781. Washington and Rochambeau march south with 7,000 Continental and French troops. They leave enough forces near New York to deceive Clinton. Field ovens and planted rumors suggest an imminent attack on the city. Clinton, cautious, does not send reinforcements to Cornwallis. The Allied armies march swiftly through New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The French troops, in pristine white uniforms, impress the Americans with their discipline. In Philadelphia, citizens cheer as they march. Then south, toward Virginia. On August 30th, de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay with 28 warships and an additional 3,000 French soldiers. It was the largest French fleet ever to operate in American waters. He immediately sent ships up the York River, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by water. On September 5th, Admiral Graves' British fleet, 19 ships sailing from New York, encountered de Grasse's fleet. The Battle of the Capes, Chesapeake, lasted 2 hours. It was technically inconclusive. Both fleets were damaged, but neither was destroyed. But strategically, it was a decisive French victory. Graves withdrew to New York for repairs, ceding control of the Chesapeake to de Grasse. Cornwallis is trapped. Late September, the American and French armies converge at Yorktown. Washington now commands 17,000 troops, Americans, French regulars, and Virginia militia. They completely surround Cornwallis, who has 8,000 men trapped at Yorktown and the smaller position of Gloucester Point across the river. Cornwallis sends desperate messages to Clinton pleading for relief. Clinton promises that a fleet with reinforcements will arrive soon. But soon is not soon enough. The siege progresses with European precision. Trenches are dug ever closer to the British fortifications. The artillery bombards relentlessly. On October 9th, Washington personally fired the first cannon of the serious bombardment. For days, 52 French and American cannons pounded the British defenses. Buildings in Yorktown were reduced to rubble. British ships on the river were sunk or set ablaze. British soldiers took refuge in any cover they could find. On October 14th, troops stormed two key British redoubts in night attacks. The Americans under Alexander Hamilton took Redoubt 10 in 10 minutes of fierce fighting. The French captured Redoubt 9. Now Allied artillery could bombard the interior of the British defenses directly. On October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after Saratoga, a British drummer appeared on the parapets, striking the signal to parley. The bombardment ceased. A British officer with a white flag requested terms. Cornwallis attempts to negotiate honorable terms. Washington, remembering how the British treated American prisoners, is inflexible. Unconditional surrender on the same terms the British imposed at Charleston. Cornwallis, with no other option, accepts. On October 19th, the British Army marched to surrender its weapons. Cornwallis, supposedly ill but probably only humiliated, sent his second-in-command, General O'Hara. 8,000 British and German soldiers marched between lines of American and French troops. The British band plays "The World Turned Upside Down," a popular British tune. The symbolism is perfect. The natural order, where empires rule colonies, has been inverted. British flags are lowered. British soldiers, many openly weeping, stack muskets. Washington accepts the formal surrender. It's a moment that seems impossible. A rebel army of peasants has forced the surrender of a professional British army. With French help, certainly. But the victory is undeniably American. November 1781. News from Yorktown reaches London like a political earthquake. Lord North, receiving the official message, paces agitatedly, repeating, "Oh God, it's all over." He is right. Parliament, divided for years over the American war, turns decisively against continuing it. The costs are unbearable. Victory is impossible. Yorktown proves that as long as France supports the rebels and controls the seas, Great Britain cannot win. In March 1782, Parliament voted to cease offensive operations in America. Lord North resigned. A new, peace-minded government took power. In April, preliminary peace negotiations began in Paris. The war is not officially over. British troops still occupy New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Skirmishes continue. But everyone knows the essential fighting is over. The United States has won its independence. The peace negotiations drag on for more than a year. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay negotiate for the United States. They navigate diplomatic complexities. France wants to limit American power. Spain rejects American independence. Great Britain seeks better terms. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Great Britain officially recognized American independence. The borders were established: the Atlantic Ocean to the east, the Mississippi River to the west, Canada to the north, and Spanish Florida to the south. It was a vast territory, twice the size of what the original 13 colonies had claimed. On November 25, 1783, the last British troops evacuated New York. Washington entered the city in triumph. On December 4th, he met with his officers at Frances Tavern to say goodbye. These were men who had suffered together for 8 years of war. Washington, normally stoic, struggled to control his emotions. With a heart full of love and gratitude, he says, "I must now take my leave of you." He embraces each officer individually. Many weep openly. Then Washington departs for Annapolis, where the Continental Congress is meeting. On December 23, 1783, George Washington did something that astonished the world. He resigned his military commission. He returned power to Congress. In an era of generals becoming dictators, Washington voluntarily became a private citizen. King George III, upon hearing this, reportedly declared, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington returned to his beloved Mount Vernon plantation, hoping never to leave home again. The war that neither side truly wanted, that cost 25,000 American and 43,000 British lives, that drained treasures and destroyed families, is finally over. 13 colonies have become a nation. But what kind of nation? That question remains unanswered. 1784. The United States is independent. But what exactly is the United States? The 13 states function as separate countries under the weak Articles of Confederation. There is no president. There is no Supreme Court. Congress lacks the power to collect taxes or regulate commerce. War debt is crushing. Veterans beg for food in the streets. The revolution won independence, but did not create a functioning government. States fight over borders, tariffs, and navigation rights. Some issue their own currencies. Hyperinflation destroys savings. Foreign creditors doubt the United States can repay its debts. In Massachusetts, indebted farmers rebelled in 1786. Shays's rebellion, led by veteran Daniel Shays, attacked courthouses, preventing foreclosures. The state militia eventually suppressed it, but the message was clear: the country was falling apart. May 1787. 55 delegates from 12 states meet in Philadelphia, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they secretly decide to draft an entirely new constitution. It's technically illegal. They do it anyway. George Washington presides over the convention. For 4 sweltering summer months, with windows closed for secrecy, they debate the form of government. The conflicts are intense. Large states against small ones, North against South, Federalists against those who fear central power. James Madison, the principal intellectual architect, proposed a government with balanced powers: executive, legislative, and judicial. Each branch checks the others. Representation is divided. The House based on population, the Senate equalizing the representation of states. It is compromise upon compromise. The most divisive and morally repugnant issue is slavery. The Southern states demand protection for the institution. The Northern delegates, many personally opposed to slavery, yield to maintain the Union. The Constitution counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, prohibits ending the slave trade until 1808, and includes a fugitive slave clause. It is the nation's original sin, the contradiction that will haunt it for 80 years until it explodes into civil war. September 1787. The Constitution is published. It requires ratification by 9 states. Debate engulfs the nation. Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, argue that strong government is necessary for survival. Anti-Federalists, including Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, warn that central power will destroy the very freedoms they fought for. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay published 85 essays, the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution. They were brilliantly argued, explaining how the proposed government would balance power and liberty. But many Americans remained skeptical. The turning point came when the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties. State by state, the ratification conventions voted. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut ratified quickly. Massachusetts, a critic, approved by a narrow margin in February 1788. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. Virginia and New York ratified it days later. North Carolina and Rhode Island would hold out until 1789 and 1790, respectively. February 1789. The Electoral College votes unanimously. George Washington will be the first president. Washington, enjoying his retirement at Mount Vernon, accepts with ambivalence. "My movement to the presidential chair," he writes, "will be accompanied by feelings no different from those of a guilty man going to the place of his execution." On April 30th, Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the temporary capital. His hand trembled visibly. After the oath, he whispered, "So help me God," setting a precedent not in the Constitution. He knew that every action set a precedent for future presidents. Washington served 8 years, declining to serve a third, even though he could have. He formed the cabinet, nominated the Supreme Court, suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion, maintained neutrality in European wars, and warned against political parties and foreign alliances. In 1797, he finally retired to Mount Vernon. He died on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67, after a brief illness. The nation mourns the man who fought for it twice, first for independence, then for constitutional stability. But the revolution left broken promises everywhere. All men are created equal sounded magnificent in 1776. The reality of 1,800 is different. Approximately 700,000 African Americans remain enslaved. Slavery, far from disappearing, expands with the cotton boom. The founders who hoped it would gradually die out were wrong. It becomes more deeply entrenched. Some African Americans fought for American independence. Crispus Attucks died in the Boston Massacre. Black regiments fought in every major campaign. Many were promised freedom for their service. Some received it. Others were re-enslaved after the war. The Native American nations, mostly allied with Great Britain out of necessity, lose disastrously. The peace treaty completely ignores them. American westward expansion, without real British restraint, will systematically destroy their societies over the next century. Women, who maintained homes, farms, and businesses while men fought, who served as spies, nurses, and occasionally soldiers, found that independence did not change their legal status. They could not vote, own property independently in most states, or control their own earnings if married. Abigail Adams warned her husband John in 1776, "Remember, ladies, do not put unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember that all men would be tyrants if they could." He laughed. She wasn't joking. The American Revolution is a paradox. It proclaims universal equality while practicing slavery. It celebrates liberty while denying rights to the majority of its population. It rejects royal tyranny while permitting domestic tyranny. It promises justice while perpetuating injustice. And yet, words matter. Ideas, once set free, cannot be taken back. All men are created equal becomes the standard against which the nation is judged, finding it deficient. Abolitionists, suffragists, and civil rights activists throughout the next century will cite the Declaration of Independence, demanding that the United States live up to its own promises. The Constitution, flawed as it is, creates a framework for change. It was amended 27 times up to 2025, abolishing slavery, expanding voting rights, and adapting to new realities. The founders created a system that, slowly and painfully, can be improved. The American Revolution inspired revolutions worldwide. The French, who helped the United States gain its independence, brought revolutionary ideas home. In 1789, the Bastille fell. The French Revolution, more radical and bloody, transformed Europe. Latin America, watching its colonies become nations, sought independence from Spain and Portugal. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led revolutions in the 19th century, inspired by the American precedent. Global colonialism eventually collapsed, though it took 2 centuries. The ideas of republican government, written constitutions, inalienable rights, and government by consent are spreading globally. They are not always perfectly implemented, often betrayed or distorted, but fundamentally transformative. The men and women who truly fought in the revolution often face forgotten ends. Many veterans died in poverty. Promised pensions arrived late or never. Land certificates were frequently worth little. Some sold their payment certificates for pennies on the dollar to speculators. Some veterans prospered. Others, like Daniel Shays, led rebellions of desperation. Still others simply vanished into the West in search of new opportunities. By 1820, most of the veterans were dead. By 1860, virtually all of them had disappeared. Their sacrifices, however, created something lasting. Not perfect, not fair to everyone, but an experiment in self-government that continues to evolve 2.5 centuries later. The American Revolution raises questions that each generation must answer anew. Who is we, and we the people? What does equality truly mean? How do we balance individual liberty with the common good? How do we redeem the unfulfilled promises of our founding documents? The founders didn't definitively answer these questions. They couldn't. They were themselves caught in the contradictions of their era. But they created a framework within which future generations could grapple with these questions. The revolution did not end in Yorktown, or with the Constitution, or when Washington died. It continues every time Americans demand that their nation live up to its founding ideals. It continues in civil rights movements, suffrage struggles, and protests for justice. 2.5 centuries later, the American Revolutionary War remains relevant. Not because it was perfect, it was far from it. Not because the founders were saints, they weren't. But because it established principles for which nations and individuals still strive. The right to self-government. The rejection of absolute authority. The idea that people can and should govern themselves. The belief that governments derive power from consent, not from force or divine right. The United States, the nation born of that revolution, has repeatedly failed to live up to those ideals. Slavery, native genocide, exclusion, injustice. The list of failures is long and painful. But the ideals endure, challenging each generation to measure up, inspiring each generation to try again. The American Revolution was not the end of history. It was the beginning of an argument about liberty, equality, justice, and democracy that continues today. That argument, that ongoing struggle to forge a more perfect union, is the true legacy of those farmers who stood up to an empire on a village green in Massachusetts one April morning 250 years ago. They fired the shot that was heard around the world. The echo still resonates.